It was a cold, quiet night, and Alex was walking home through the dark woods. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches swaying like twisted hands reaching for something. As he walked, Alex felt a strange shiver run down his spine. The path through the forest was lonely and unfamiliar, but he couldn't take the longer way around. He had to get home before his parents worried. Suddenly, he heard a soft, almost inaudible voice. It sounded like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was calling out to him. Alex stopped and looked around, his heart racing. "Hello," he called out, but there was no reply. He took a few cautious steps forward, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease building in his chest. Then, through the trees, he saw something. A figure lying on the ground, barely visible in the dim light. At first, Alex thought it was an animal, but as he got closer, he realized it was a woman. She was pale, her long dark hair tangled and wet, her clothes torn and covered in dirt. She was lying on her back, her eyes closed, and her breathing shallow. Her skin was almost as white as the snow, and yet there was something strangely beautiful about her. Alex felt a mix of fear and compassion. Who was she? How did she end up here alone, in the middle of nowhere, injured? The woman's lips parted slightly, and in a weak voice, she whispered, "Help me." Without thinking, Alex knelt beside her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman opened her eyes slowly, her gaze locking with his. Her eyes were a deep, dark brown, full of sadness and pain. She looked at him like she was lost, as if she didn't even remember who she was. "You shouldn't have come," she murmured, her voice distant and cold. "It's too late, they're coming for me." Alex's heart pounded. He didn't know who they were, but there was something about the woman's words that sent a chill through him. Despite the fear rising inside him, he couldn't leave her like this. He gently helped her sit up. "I'll help you," he said, trying to steady his voice. "You're safe now." But even as he said the words, he knew deep down that he was far from safe, and neither was she. Alex carefully helped the woman to her feet, supporting her weight as she stumbled slightly. Her body felt cold, almost unnaturally so, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She looked fragile, as if the slightest movement could break her. He kept his arm around her waist, guiding her through the dense trees, trying to make their way back to his house. "Where are we going?" the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex looked down at her, noticing the pale skin on her arms, the deep bruises that marred her body. Her clothes were torn, and dried blood stained her legs. "You need help," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "I'm taking you to my place. You'll be safe there." She didn't resist as he led her through the forest, but something about the way she moved made Alex uneasy. It was as though she wasn't entirely present, as though her body was here, but her mind was far away. She barely spoke, only muttering strange words that made no sense, as if she were trapped in her own thoughts. Her eyes, though beautiful, seemed distant, lost in some dark memory that haunted her. By the time they reached Alex's house, the night had grown colder, the air thick with tension. He quickly opened the door, helping the woman inside. The house was quiet, with only the flickering light from a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The atmosphere felt heavier than usual, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But he pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the woman in front of him. He gently guided her to the couch, where she sat down slowly. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, she seemed to focus on him as though seeing him for the first time. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you helping me?" Alex hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. "I'm Alex," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I couldn't just leave you there. You were hurt." The woman's lips trembled, and she looked down at her hands, which were shaking. "You shouldn't have," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They'll come for you too." Alex frowned, unsure of what she meant. He had heard the fear in her voice, but he didn't know who she was talking about. "Who will come for me?" he asked, his voice low. Her gaze met his again, and this time, there was a deep sadness in her eyes. "The ones who did this to me," she said softly. "They won't stop until they get what they want." Alex felt a chill run through him. He didn't know who this woman was, or what she had been through, but one thing was certain: her past was dangerous, and he had just become part of it. As the woman sat on the couch, Alex hurried to find a first aid kit. His hands were shaking, but he tried to steady himself, knowing he had to help her. He could feel her eyes on him, watching every movement he made. There was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by the sound of his quick breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards. When Alex returned, he sat beside her, carefully unrolling the first aid supplies. The woman's gaze never wavered from him, and it made him uneasy. She looked as though she was lost, like a ghost caught in the present, unable to escape the past. He gently took her arm, inspecting the cuts and bruises. The skin was raw and torn, the wounds deep and angry. "I need to clean these," Alex said softly, as he dabbed a cotton ball in antiseptic. The woman flinched slightly as he touched the wounds, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him with those deep, sorrowful eyes. "I don't remember how this happened," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't remember anything." Alex paused, his hands hovering over the wound. He couldn't help but feel sympathy for her, even though he didn't understand what had happened to her. The pain in her voice was real, and it tugged at something deep inside him. He pressed the cotton ball to her skin, trying to clean the blood and dirt from the wound. "Do you remember your name?" Alex asked softly, wanting to know more about her. She hesitated for a moment before shaking her head slowly. No, I don't remember anything. It's all foggy. I was just running. I was running away from something, someone." Alex looked at her, puzzled. Running away from who? The woman's eyes filled with fear, and she pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them tightly. "I can't remember," she whispered, "but they won't stop until they find me. They'll keep coming, until they get me." Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea who she was talking about, but the fear in her voice felt real. It was as if some terrible force was hunting her, and no matter how much she tried to escape, it would never let her go. As Alex finished dressing her wounds, he looked at her with a mixture of worry and determination. "You're safe here, okay? I won't let anyone hurt you." The woman's gaze softened for a moment, and she whispered, "Thank you for saving me." But deep down, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that by helping her, he had just stepped into a nightmare far darker than he could ever imagine. The next few days were strange. The woman, whom Alex had started calling Eliza, though she had no memory of her real name, had begun to recover physically. Her wounds were healing, and her strength seemed to return with each passing day. But there was something off about her. She never left the house, not even to step outside for fresh air. Her eyes were always darting to the windows, and at night, she would sit by them, staring out into the dark woods, her face drawn with fear. One night, as Alex was cleaning the kitchen, he heard her soft voice, almost a whisper, coming from the living room. "They're coming," she said. Alex froze, his hands trembling as he set the dish down. He didn't know who they were, but the fear in her voice made his heart race. He walked into the living room, his steps slow and cautious. "Eliza," he called gently, but she didn't turn around. She was standing by the window again, staring out into the darkness, her body tense. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer immediately, but her body was shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Alex felt a chill creep over him, an icy feeling that settled deep in his bones. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally long. "They're here," Eliza finally whispered, her voice trembling. "They've found me." Before Alex could respond, the house was plunged into silence. The usual sounds of the night, distant traffic, the wind rustling the trees outside, faded into nothing. It was as if the world had stopped. Eliza's eyes widened in terror as she backed away from the window, her hands reaching out toward Alex. "Alex, they're coming for both of us," she gasped. "You have to leave. Now. You don't know what they are." Suddenly, Alex heard it, an eerie sound, like whispers that weren't coming from any person. It filled the room, swirling around him like a cold wind. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving closer. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He looked at Eliza, her face filled with dread. "What are they?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're spirits," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "Evil ones. They've been after me for so long. They'll never stop until they get what they want." Before Alex could respond, the whispers grew louder, the temperature dropping even further. The room felt suffocating, as if something dark and dangerous was closing in on them. Eliza grabbed his arm tightly, her grip firm but desperate. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the haunting sounds. In that moment, Alex knew they weren't just ghosts. Whatever had been chasing Eliza was far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. The room seemed to tremble as the whispers grew louder, surrounding Alex and Eliza. Shadows twisted, crawling along the walls like dark figures, their forms flickering in and out of sight. Eliza's grip tightened on Alex's arm, her fingers icy cold, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he pulled her closer, as if her presence was the only thing anchoring him to reality. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own, but there was something else in them too, something soft, something he didn't understand. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No matter where I go, they'll follow. You should leave, Alex. You don't have to be part of this." But Alex shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "I can't leave you. I won't." Eliza's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she seemed lost, torn between the fear that had haunted her for so long and the connection she was beginning to feel with him. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they were deafening. Alex could feel the cold presence of something terrible closing in, but he didn't want to give in to the fear. He wouldn't let her face this alone. Without thinking, Alex took Eliza's face in his hands, gently brushing away the tears that had fallen from her eyes. "We'll face this together," he said, his voice strong, though his insides were churning with fear. "I'm not leaving you. I'll protect you." For the first time since Alex had found her in the woods, Eliza looked at him with something more than fear in her eyes, something that felt like a spark of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. Slowly, she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his as if she were seeking comfort in his warmth. "I've been so alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I was meant to wander forever, but now." She didn't finish her sentence, but Alex understood. He understood the fear of being lost, of being alone. And, for the first time, he understood the depth of her pain. He leaned forward and kissed her gently, a soft, lingering kiss that was full of promise, of comfort, and of love. The air in the room shifted. The coldness that had filled the house began to recede, and the whispers grew faint, as if they were losing their power. But the shadows were still there, watching, waiting. "Love can break curses," Eliza whispered as she pulled back slightly, her voice barely above a breath. "But I'm not sure if love alone is enough." Before Alex could say anything, the room was filled with a brilliant light, blinding in its intensity. The shadows recoiled, the whispers fading into nothing. Eliza's body trembled, and Alex held her tightly as the light enveloped them both. For a moment, everything went still. When the light faded and the room returned to normal, Eliza was no longer in his arms. She was gone, but in her place was a warmth, a feeling of peace that lingered in the air. Alex stood there, stunned. He had lost her, but he knew deep in his heart, that her love would never truly leave him. She had been freed, and though the darkness had tried to take her, it had failed. With a quiet, bittersweet smile, Alex whispered to the empty room, "I'll never forget you." And in his heart, she would live on forever.